Hi again. This is Ed Rudiger, and welcome to the Bible Bunker. It's been a long time. Jesus. I was checking, and the last one I left was at the end of August. So we went the whole month of September and half of October without having another one of these sessions. That's on me, I guess. Daughter going to college and still dealing with the pandemic and a lot of other stuff going on in my life, just didn't get around to doing it. But that's a reason, not an excuse. I'm glad you've tuned in. I'm glad you're ready to study God's Word, and I hope you find this one as helpful as the other ones have been. As a matter of fact, since there's been such a big gap, you may want to review some of the early ones, just so that you can get a running start. Uh, Remember, as we look at the Gospels, it's really important to stay inside the Gospel to get the narrative flow that the evangelist wants to convey. And so, although we're going to review a little bit here, it might be helpful for you to look at what we talked about in the past. So, anyway, with that having been said, let's begin where we left off, way, these 45 days ago, and let's focus on the 10th chapter of Mark, beginning in verse 32. Now, like I said, we want to, though, not just start there. We want to give a little bit of review, so that we're on the same page. Uh, like I just said, each of the evangelists is approaching Jesus Christ, the Christ event, in a slightly different way. And so we're going to really focus on how Mark sees it. Now, that's going to be important in what we look at today, because there's some differences between Mark and Matthew and Luke. And remember, I said earlier on, I believe Mark is the first gospel written, because almost all of Mark is in the Gospel of Matthew. Most of Mark is in the Gospel of Luke. I think both Matthew and Luke had Mark in front of them when they were structuring their Gospels. So I think Mark is the earliest. Still, Matthew and Luke change a little of Mark uh, to convey the theological points that they want to convey. Each of the evangelists, and John is a whole different story, each of the evangelists have their own perspective on who Jesus Christ is, and maybe more important, who we are. They're each writing to distinct populations, communities, uh, that have their own values and their own background, and therefore, as good communicators, they're trying to communicate to them. So we're going to stay in the Gospel of Mark, although we'll use the other Gospels, particularly Matthew and Luke, to sort of understand what's going on in Mark a little bit better. Now, if you remember way back in ancient times, and I'm talking about the beginning of this study, uh, we said that the thesis of Mark's Gospel, not only the thesis and the structure of Mark's Gospel, we can find in verse 1, where it says, the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God. Now, if you break that down, it is the gospel, the euangelion, the good news, that great announcement when the victory's been won. This is a gospel. This is not a biography. This is a gospel of Jesus. This is the good news, how Jesus personifies the victory we have through God. So that's what the work is. It's gospel. It's not purporting to be historical. It is instead a theological piece that explains the good news. And the good news is about who? Jesus, right? And after the evangelist, so we got the good news of Jesus, and then the evangelist gives us two titles that he spends the rest of the gospel developing. One is Christ. Often we talk about Jesus Christ like his mail came to Mr. J. Christ. That Christ is the last name, but it isn't. Christ is a title. It's Messiah. It's the anointed one. So we've got these two titles that follow: Jesus, and then you could almost put a colon if you were really into grammar. The Gospel of Jesus, colon, Christ, comma, Son of God. And Mark spends the first half of his gospel dealing with, right up to the end of chapter 6, dealing with who Jesus is as the Christ, the anointed one. And then he spends the second half of his gospel dealing with who Jesus is as Son of God. First section ends in a confession. You are the Christ. That's Peter at Caesarea Philippi. The second part ends at a confession, the centurion at the cross. This is truly, he is the Son of God. So we've got two confessions in each. We've got each section beginning with an affirmation from God. The first half at the baptism, where he says, you are my Son, the beloved one, in whom I am well pleased. And at the transfiguration, which is early in the second half of the gospel, where he says, he is my Son, the beloved one, listen to him. So we've got this affirmation of God beginning each of the parts. So I think the structure is relatively clear. Now, in the first half of the gospel, Mark presents, and as I describe this, and you know this if you've listened to other ones, I'm going to describe it more as Mark as a writer, not just a reporter jotting down facts, but rather a writer who is shaping the story. Mark introduces to us the main characters. And of course, we've got a protagonist, a hero in the first part, the focus, the positive figure. And of course, that is Jesus. This is his story. So he becomes the protagonist in that first section of Mark. And we find out a lot about Jesus by what he does. And all of this is to establish who Jesus is as a Christ. I mean, Jesus, remember some of the things he does. He performs miracles, right? He heals the sick. He casts out demons. He teaches in these wonderful parables. Jesus, that's who Jesus is. Demonstrating authority over water, which is a symbol of chaos, authority over the unclean spirits. Jesus, and in doing that, Jesus establishes himself, or at least Mark establishes Jesus as the Christ. This is what the Christ means. So he is the protagonist. Now that shifts when we pass the confession of Peter at Caesarea Philippi. We'll get to that in just a minute. So we've got him introduced. And then we've got the enemies introduced. And the enemies in the story really aren't the devil, because the devil doesn't play a big role in the Gospel of Mark as opposed to the others. The real enemies are the Pharisees and the scribes. And understand, in Mark's community, they were probably the only Jews left. The Sadducees were so focused on the temple. Once the Jerusalem falls, Sadducees sort of cease to exist. The same thing with the Herodians. They after Herod Agrippa, the Herodians kind of fade from the scene. So the Pharisees are the only Jews left, and so Mark focuses his community on those Jews that are left. They are the enemy, and they decide very early in Mark that they need to kill Jesus. And do you remember why they decide to kill Jesus? It's not because he's breaking the law. It's because although he is, in their mind, Jesus does break the law, Mark makes it very clear that their reason for killing him isn't the fact that he breaks the law, but that the law has kind of become perverse and has actually moved people to not care about the welfare of others. It's kind of taken on a life of its own. Remember, they start to conspire to kill him, not after he forgives sin, not after his disciples are eating grain, which is violating reaping laws on the Sabbath. It's when he heals the man with the withered hand. And Jesus makes it very clear that he is doing good on the Sabbath, and that's why they're going to get him. The Pharisees and the scribes are no longer doing good. So we've got Jesus on one side, and we've got the scribes and the Pharisees on the other. And then in the middle, we got all kinds of people that are kind of floating around. Two groups are very obvious. We've got the disciples, and the disciples have been called by Christ. They're his inner circle. They hear extra teachings. They've left things to follow him. They are ultimately going to recognize him as the Christ. Although they're not demonstrating genuine faith yet, because you can't have faith in just the Christ. That's only half of who Jesus is. You got to understand him as Son of God. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So we have the disciples that are following him around. They're observing him do these miracles. They are privy to not just the teachings, but explanations about the teachings. They are there when evil spirits are cast out. They see Jesus walking on water. They see Jesus feeding the 5,000 with 12 baskets left over, 4,000 with 7 baskets left over. They are there. And that's why their experience kind of culminates with Peter's confession that he is indeed the Christ. So the disciples see that. Now, again, we're going to pause there before we go into the next section. I want to mention, because this is going to be pertinent today, the role disciples play in the Gospels is really very interesting. And we're going to see in what we look at today, this portion from the 10th chapter, that Mark, probably more than the other evangelists, Mark is probably more critical of the disciples than Matthew, Luke, or John. And that kind of makes sense. You think of one of the dangers in the early church may have faced, and we see that alluded to in Paul's letter to the first letter to the Corinthians and in his letter to the Galatians, that people started to almost venerate the disciples. That the disciples had a higher status than other folks, and veneration, there's a very fine line between veneration and worship. And so the disciples may have been so respected in the church around 70 AD and even more later, that one of the things Mark seems very, very concerned about is maybe that the disciples are becoming so important that they are pushing Jesus to the back. And so Mark tends to be very, very harsh on the disciples and how he portrays the disciples. That's not going to be the case in the Gospels of Luke, and most particularly in the Gospel of Matthew. The disciples are going to be presented in a much better light, and we're going to see an example of that in the passage we're looking at today when we compare Mark and Matthew. Okay, so we've got Jesus, the protagonist. We've got the antagonists, the scribes and the Pharisees. We've got disciples that are sort of if you got a midpoint, sort of on the Jesus side of the midpoint. We've got the devil, but he's, like I said, not playing a big role. He was part of the temptation. We've got demonic spirits that are involved there. They're on the evil side. One of the things really interesting, though, to note about the demonic spirits, they know who Jesus is. The disciples don't, the scribes and the Pharisees don't, but the demonic spirits do. God knows who Jesus is, and we know who Jesus is. Mark doesn't want us to be part of the story. He wants us to observe the story. So we know things that other people don't. We hear God speaking. We hear God affirm him as Son of God. We hear when the demons leave that he's the Son of God. So we hear that. The people in the story don't always hear that. So we understand things they don't. Now, the big group that is just sort of out there and don't know whether it's on the Jesus side or sort of on the Pharisee side are what Mark calls the aklos, which are the crowds. They are just people who are wandering around. They participate in some of the miracles. They hear the stories, but they don't hear the explanations. They are sort of there. They scare the pudding out of the Pharisees, so they don't want to mess with Jesus with the crowds around. But the crowds aren't expressing anything that comes close to faith. They are just there. They are the recipients of free food. They like the healing, but we don't know where they stand. They're just sort of there. Okay, now this is it, and like I said, Caesarea Philippi, bang, Peter establishes Jesus as the Christ. And as soon as he does that, the whole tone of the gospel changes. And in fact, Jesus' message changes, because we're not talking about kingdom of God anymore. We're talking about the Son of Man, which is a title Jesus applies to himself, and how the Son of Man in particular has to suffer. And when he starts doing that, the disciples all of a sudden become clueless. They not only don't understand what he's saying, they don't like what he's saying. And so Jesus ends up, they become more and more confused. And that really leads us to what we're looking at now. So Jesus is moving towards Jerusalem. He is talking about his suffering, which is ultimately going to culminate on a cross. And there the centurion is going to confess him as Son of God. The disciples, the enemies are still there. The scribes and Pharisees are still the bad guys. The disciples are showing themselves to be less than knowledgeable. So they aren't nearly as close or involved as they were before, even though Mark has dropped in early on that the disciples are a little bit clueless. Anyway, so we've got the characters introduced, we got this confession, and now Jesus is talking very clearly about suffering and dying. And he's, when we get to chapter 10, verses 32, he's already done that 3 times. He's already talked about how he's going to suffer twice. I'm sorry, this is the 3rd time. He's already done it twice. And it's really interesting. In each of the other 2, the response of the disciples has been less than exemplary. The first time he says it, Peter pulls him aside and says, "You got to stop talking about this." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're tempting me to divert my attention from where it should be, and that's the suffering. You're trying to get me to move away from why I'm here." That's the first time. Second time he does it, the disciples, right afterwards, Mark tells us the disciples are having a debate about who's the most important, which is kind of missing the whole point of sacrifice. Remember, the first time he says it, he even says disciples are going to say, "If you want to follow me, you got to deny yourself, take up your cross, follow me." So it's not, this life isn't going to be easy. Clearly the disciples don't get it because they're fighting over who's most important. All right, so he's already done that twice, moving toward Jerusalem. We are at verse 32 of chapter 10, and for a 3rd time, Jesus tells his disciples what's going to happen. And it's pretty much the same. They're on the road to Jerusalem, so Mark is telling us where they're going. Jerusalem's important. Everybody who's hearing this knows the story. They know what's going to happen in Jerusalem. Jesus is moving towards his destiny. He pulls them aside, and he tells them about how he's going to be handed over. He says to the chief priests and scribes, they're going to condemn him to death. He's going to be handed over to the Gentiles. They're going to mock him, spit on him, flog him, kill him. Now, this is a lot more detail. And if you look at the three times he predicts the suffering, Son of Man suffering, each time it becomes a little more detailed in the Gospel of Mark. Not only does his description become more detailed, the response from the disciples become even, well, I guess you could call it, become worse, become less sensitive, demonstrate even less knowledge. For example, the first one was Peter, just pulling him aside. Second one, they were arguing about who's most important. Now it becomes really blatant because Jesus makes this prediction, and this is exactly what's going to happen to Jesus when he gets to Jerusalem. He's going to suffer and die. And immediately, verse 35, we've got James and John, sons of Zebedee. Now, why would James and John be particularly important? They were in that first 4 called. You had Peter and Andrew, James and John. They are part of that inner group. So they are the important ones. These aren't the fringe disciples, even the fringe apostles. This is the core. This is at the center. These are the guys that should know. And they come forward to ask him a question. Now, this is going to be important later in what we're looking at tonight. That they come with a request. And Jesus says, "What do you want? What do you want from me?" Remember a little bit earlier, we had the the young man, or the man who was rich, came to him as well with a question about eternal life. So they come to him and ask a question. And what they want is they want Jesus to give them permission to sit on the right hand, on his right hand and on his left when he comes in glory. Now, that's kind of interesting. Why would sitting with Jesus in the middle, John on one side, James on the other side, why would that be important? Man, those are positions of power, aren't they? They are asking for positions of power and status when when Jesus comes, returns in his glory, when his kingdom is made real. They're really not looking to Jesus' glory, right? Because Jesus is going to be glorified where? Man, he's going to be glorified on a cross. They're not looking for his glory. They're looking for their own glory. They want Jesus to grant them a special status. Now, that is far worse than Peter pulling him aside and saying, maybe you shouldn't talk about this stuff. And much worse than the disciples having a debate over which one is most important. They are now asking Jesus for special favors. This isn't James and John coming off looking very, very good. Now, it's interesting. Like I said, Mark tends to be harsher on the disciples than the others. If we take the parallel passage from Matthew, where we've got the same request, it doesn't come from James and John. It comes from James and John's mother. So it's like Matthew wants to protect James and John from making the request and throwing the mother under the bus. Mark isn't going to do that. In the Gospel of Mark, I don't think wants us, the reader, to see the disciples as these sort of superhuman people who are above us. They are there with all their humanity. Okay, so they ask Jesus. Jesus replies, you don't know what you're asking. Are you going to be able to drink from the cup or be baptized with baptism I'm going to be baptized with? Now, we pretty much know what that means. It has to do with his death. You're asking me this. Are you willing to do what I'm gonna do? And of course, because they want Jesus to do this, they say, sure, we're able. Absolutely. They don't have a clue. But Jesus tells them, you know something? You are going to face that. You are going to be baptized. Now, I can't grant you what you want. This is not mine to give you. That's in the hands of God. Now, structurally, we got what's called a little chiasm here, and chiasms are used for contrast. It's a kind of parallelism. You flow in and out. It's like A, B, B prime, A prime. And what we've got is a contrast, and it's to contrast James and John with Jesus. Let me tell you what's happening here. We've got James and John making their request to sit at the right and left. Jesus saying, are you willing to be baptized with my baptism? They say yes. That's A, B. And then notice how we come out of it. Because Jesus says, well, you are going to be baptized, B prime. You are going to face my baptism. You will drink from that cup. And then A prime, but I can't grant your request. So we have this nice little chiasm, which I think Mark is using to contrast the disciples from Jesus. Now, when the other disciples, so James and John are not coming out looking really good here. And Mark, in case we miss it, Mark tells us that the other disciples don't like what they've done. So there's divisions within the disciples. And Jesus reminds them, but maybe more importantly, Mark reminds the reader in a church 50 years after this is occurring, that, being in the church isn't achieving great status. It's not sitting at the right or the left. It's not being respected by folks. It's not being admired by girls. People, you don't become you don't have a fan club. That's not what being part of this community, this church, being a follower of Jesus is about. That's what they do out in the world. In fact, greatness in the kingdom of God isn't where you sit, it's how much you serve. It isn't how much you get, it's how much you give. That's how greatness is measured in this new reality, this new kingdom that is dawning with Jesus Christ. Now, the disciples wouldn't have a clue what he's talking about here because they're still focused on who's most important, who's not. But we, the reader, especially the reader in the early church, we know exactly what he means. That's what it's all about. If we get the idea that it's all about us, we're missing the boat. Okay, so we've got this third, and this is the last time he's going to predict his death and his suffering and death. We've got the last time in this structural way that the disciples are going to do something really boneheaded to show that they don't understand the importance of suffering at all. They don't even understand discipleship. Although they should, they don't. They are pretty much clueless. Now, when we get to verse 46, chapter 10, he's close to a city called Jericho. Now, I don't think here Mark is bringing in, the fable walls of Jericho falling down. I don't think he's doing that. But Jericho is a city close to Jerusalem. And I think what Mark is doing is he's emphasizing, he's already told us that they're moving to Jerusalem. He's emphasizing how close they are. They're much closer. Okay, so there's the disciples are there. One of the characters in the story, the disciples. We got the crowd there, another character in the story, and they're heading to Jerusalem when all of a sudden there's a blind beggar named Bartimaeus there, and he's sitting beside the road. Now he hears that Jesus of Nazareth is coming, and he begins to shout. Now, the only way he could have heard is that somebody in that crowd told him, right? And he starts shouting. And this is really interesting. What does he shout? He shouts, Jesus, son of David. Now understand, this is the first time anybody has called Jesus the son of David. Why would Mark, for the first time, have Jesus given this title? That hadn't applied to him before. Well, he's close to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is called the city of dun, 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 city of David, right? That's his capital city. So that's where the temple is. That's where David had his palace. This is David's city. He's getting close. So now the Bartimaeus, this blind beggar, is shouting this out. Now, Jesus is going to hear this same affirmation in just a little bit when he enters the city on what we call Palm Sunday, when the triumphal entry. He's going to be greeted with the same kind of title. This is sort of a precursor of what's going to happen. Okay, so we've got him saying something today. Now, the people who hear that aren't real keen. This beggar is making a lot of noise. I don't know why. What I just did is sort of what I encourage you not to do, sort of psychologize what's going on. If Mark wants us to know what was going on in their heads, he'd have told us. All we know is they wanted the person to be quiet. But the more quiet, the more they wanted him quiet, the louder he shouted. Now, think about it. What does that show about Bartimaeus? That he is very, very intent on Jesus doing, and remember, he doesn't ask Jesus to make me see. He doesn't say, Jesus, make me see, give me my sight. He says, Jesus, have mercy on me. When you compare that with what James and John just asked Jesus, you got a pretty stark contrast. James and John wanted status. Bartimaeus wants mercy. So Jesus calls Bartimaeus to him. The people say, take heart, get up. He's calling you. I think this is a little message to the church later. This is what it's going to take. Jesus is calling you, but you're going to certainly need to have a strong heart and strong muscles, to get up and go. You got to have courage. You got to have strength. And so he gets up and he throws off his cloak. Now, understand, he's a beggar. He didn't have much. But to go to Jesus, he throws off what he the little bit that he has. I don't think that's an accident. Because remember a little earlier in the story when somebody else came to Jesus asking Jesus for a favor, I'm thinking of the rich young man, he couldn't throw off anything. When Jesus would give you money to the poor, the guy couldn't do it. But here Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, throws off his cloak and comes to Jesus. One of the themes I think we see in Mark, probably stronger than we see in the others, although it's very strong also in Luke, is the outcasts, the poor, end up having stronger roles in the story. They become more prominent. They become almost favored by Jesus. And this is certainly an outsider. I mean, he's blind, and the writer says he's beside the road. And in Greek, oudos, which is road, it can also be translated way. So he is outside of the way. He is away from the disciples. He's over to the side. But right here when Jesus calls him, he comes in. He's now on the road. He approaches Jesus because Jesus wants him. And the blind man says to him, "Teacher," now he asks, "Let me see." Now, the fact that he calls him teacher still shows that he really doesn't understand who Jesus is. Not a surprise. Nobody really understands who Jesus is until he's crucified on a cross. Not according to the Gospel of Mark. A little different in John, but in Mark, people are not going to understand who Jesus is until they see him also as Son of God. So the fact that he's called him teacher is not a surprise. Disciples have done that. Pharisees have done that. That seems to be one of the titles, rabbi, that they use for Jesus. He says, "Let me see." And Jesus' response is similar to a response he's made before in situations. He talks about faith. His faith is making him well. Now, faith is really important because, and we've talked about it before, faith can also be translated trust. And so what that blind man is doing is he's not affirming a set of theological issues. Instead, his whole approach and request reflects his belief that God, through Jesus, can make him well, can make him whole. And as he's made whole, he's able to see. Okay? So Jesus, now what this blind beggar does stands in sharp contrast with the rich young ruler who wasn't able. And notice after he's healed, he's able to see, or after Jesus says that, it says he immediately, and remember that's one of Mark's favorite words, immediately, because he likes to drive the story. Immediately he could see, and what does Bartimaeus do? He starts following him on the way, on the road. So he moved from beside the road. He was blind beside the road. Think of the symbolism of being blind. If we look at the story, who are the people who are spiritually blind? Well, geez Louise, we got the scribes and the Pharisees. They're blind. The disciples don't have a clue. James and John, geez, they don't see anything. That's why they made that bonehead request. They're pretty much blind. This guy, this beggar, he was blind, and he was off away from outside of the way. He regains his sight. He can see. Physically, yes. Spiritually, maybe even more. Symbolic vision, maybe even more. And as soon as he regains his sight, he starts following Jesus. And I don't think it's an accident that he is following Jesus on the way. Now, the next step is getting into Jerusalem, but that'll be during our next session. And I promise you it won't be 45 days from now. Just want you to think about what we've covered to this point. We know Jesus is the Christ. Everybody knows that. Scribes hate him for it. The disciples have become more and more clueless as Jesus has predicted his suffering. Now understand, he's predicting this to the disciples. So the crowd isn't privy to this. But as Jesus becomes more detailed in his description of his suffering, the disciples become more clueless and demonstrate that by doing more outlandish things, moving from just criticizing Jesus to debating among themselves to actually asking Jesus to give them status and prestige. Right before he enters the city of Jerusalem, we've got this story with Bartimaeus, who who demonstrates faith, demonstrates trust, and gains sight and enters the way. So we've got Jesus ready to enter Jerusalem. We've got the disciples moving further and further away from understanding who Jesus is. We still got the big antagonists, the scribes and the Pharisees, and we've got Jesus moving to face his destiny. Okay. I appreciate you tuning in. Like I said, I apologize personally for it being so long. Next time, and I hope to be able to do that in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be looking at Mark 11, 1 through 33. So you might want to read ahead. Again, thank you for listening. I hope you found the study helpful, and I will talk to you again soon.